right, let's get right into it. We're going to talk about global debt. But, not as some boring number you see on a news ticker. Think of it more like a massive storm that's building just over the horizon. And the really weird part? Right now, if you look up, the sky seems almost perfectly clear. It's that quiet that's so unsettling.
And look, it's not just me saying that. This quote from the Atlantic Council, reporting from the big IMF and World Bank meetings, just nails it. They heard person after person describe this exact feeling, this uneasy quiet. It's this sense that even though things look kind of stable on the surface, something huge is building underneath. That's the vibe coming from the world's top financial minds. And really, it's the perfect setup for what we need to dig into.
So just how big are we talking? Let's put a number on this storm. 235%. That's the total amount of debt. We're talking governments, companies, you, me, everyone, compared to the entire world's economic output for a year. It is a mind-boggling amount of money, a literal mountain of IOUs. And a debt pile that big makes the whole system super, super fragile. But here's the kicker. That huge number? It's not even the scariest part of this story. Not by a long shot. So that brings us to the real trigger, what we're calling the interest rate shockwave. This is what turned a big, but maybe manageable problem into a full-blown crisis. See, for years and years, borrowing money was dirt cheap. Well, guess what? Those days are over. Completely. And this comparison here just lays it all out. The IMF basically breaks it down into two different worlds. First, you had the old reality, pretty much the decade after 2008. Debt was going up, sure, but because interest rates were practically zero, the cost of that debt stayed flat. It was manageable. Now we're in the new reality. Debt is still climbing, but the interest costs are absolutely exploding. And that, right there, changes the entire game. And you can see the impact right here in the numbers. This is what it actually looks like. The IMF projects that what governments spend just on interest is going to jump from 2% of global GDP to almost 3% by 2025. Now, I know what you're thinking. 1%, what's the big deal? But that 1% is hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. That's money that can't go to schools or roads or hospitals. It's just gone. It's a massive drain on public finances, and it's happening everywhere.
Okay, so this all leads us to a really specific and very near-term problem, especially for the U.S. It's being called the 2025 refinancing wall. Because the U.S. issues the world's go-to safe investment, Treasury bonds, it has a unique role, and right now a massive bill is about to come due. Just look at this number, $9.2 trillion. That's how much U.S. government debt, according to Deloitte, has to be paid back by the end of 2025. And let's be super clear, this isn't spending on new stuff. This is old debt that's hitting its expiration date. And how do you pay it back? Well, you have to borrow new money to pay off the old.
And this is where the trap snaps shut. That $9.2 trillion, a lot of it was borrowed when interest rates were basically zero. But now, it has to be refinanced at today's much, much higher rates. So what happens? You're locking in these huge interest payments for years to come. It creates this vicious cycle where your debt just keeps getting more and more expensive to carry. So that begs a pretty big question, right? If your debt costs are exploding and you can't just not pay, what on earth do you do? Well, it turns out governments have a playbook for exactly this situation. It's a pretty controversial and kind of sneaky strategy called financial repression.
Really think about it. How can a government possibly pay for all this?
The only other options seem to either jacking up taxes to sky-high levels or completely gutting public services. Neither is very popular. So instead, they turn to a set of tools that, well, they essentially let them rewrite the rules of the financial game to benefit themselves. So what exactly is financial repression? Put simply, it's a collection of policies that governments use to funnel money from the private sector, that means from savers, from pension funds, from you, to themselves. It's an indirect way of getting a handle on their debt by basically forcing the financial system to give them a cheap loan. And this playbook has a few key moves. For instance, they can put a cap on interest rates to make sure their own borrowing costs stay low. They create what are called captive markets. This is a big one, where they basically force institutions, like the pension funds that hold our retirement money, to buy government bonds, even if those bonds are a terrible investment. They can also make it harder to move money out of the country. And of course, the one we've all seen a lot of lately, they get their own central bank to just buy up huge amounts of government debt. The reason this stuff is so tempting for politicians is that it's way less obvious than a big tax hike. So, what does this actually mean for you, for me, for pretty much everyone? Well, the end result is that savers, and that's anyone with a bank account or a 401k, end up earning interest that's lower than the real rate of inflation. In other words, your money is actively losing value, losing its purchasing power day after day. And please understand, this is not some unforeseen side effect. It's the whole point. It's a quiet, hidden tax that eats away at your savings to pay down the government's debt.
So with all this going on, what's the big global watchdog, the IMF, saying about it? Well, their latest take is basically a flashing red light. A final warning, you could say, about the huge financial risks that are building up all over the world.
And their message couldn't be clearer. It really hammers home the point we've been circling this whole time. They're saying the main problem has changed. It's not just about how big the debt pile is anymore. The real critical danger now is the soaring cost of servicing that debt. In their words, it has drastically changed the dynamics of public debt. And look how widespread this is. The IMF is now flagging 55 different countries as being at high or even distressed levels of financial risk. 55. This isn't an isolated problem in one or two places. It's a global vulnerability. And it's the smaller developing countries that are often the most exposed if things suddenly go south.
And that leaves us with one last really big question. We're clearly in uncharted waters here. We have governments all over the world dealing with a historic debt crisis by, let's be honest, rewriting the financial rules to save themselves. So as they do that, as they deploy this playbook to keep things stable, you have to wonder who is ultimately going to pay the price.